may have a seat. We are starting a new series called Love Stories, and I spoke to our last service and I said, guys, don't worry, we're not going to play pop culture love songs. Don't worry, we're not going to talk about romantic relationships. Don't worry about I don't know anybody that would talk about Song of Songs for 5 weeks long, and so we're not going to do that. What we're doing is we're looking at parables of Jesus, where he talks about the primary topic seems to have something to do with love, whether it's loving God or loving others or receiving love from God. We're talking about the parables of Jesus that seem to pertain most to love. And so I'm excited about this series because we're also not trying to get these parables to fit together in any special way. They kind of show up throughout Scripture, and so each Sunday we'll be treating them as they come, independent from one another, and just saying, Lord, what are you saying? And what was Jesus saying to his audience? And as the gospel writers write these down, what are they saying to the people that will read them? So as we work week by week, we'll just be digging into a large portion of Scripture and asking ourselves, what is this saying to us? Now, I want you to do something real quick. I'm going to stop talking, and pastors don't normally create time for that, so I want you to use this time wisely. Okay, I'm going to stop talking, and what I want you to do is I want you to think for a minute, how do I know that I'm forgiven? And then, when you're feeling brave enough, I want you to turn to somebody next to you and say, this is how I know that I've been forgiven. Right? I promise I don't do this often, but I just want you to think for a moment, how do you know that you're forgiven? Now, turn to somebody next to you and tell them how you know that you're forgiven. You're all wrong. No, I know. Hopefully some of you said something like, I know I'm forgiven because Jesus Christ died on the cross and his death is a sufficient sacrifice for my sins. Hopefully some of you said, I know I'm forgiven because there's an empty tomb, and so I know that everything that Jesus said was true. Hopefully some of you said, I know I'm forgiven because I've placed my trust in Jesus Christ and he is my Lord and Savior. Hopefully none of you said, I know I'm forgiven because I go to church a lot and I've got perfect Sunday school attendance. And if you said that, schedule a meeting with me. I've been to court more times than I care to admit, but I will admit one of the times that I've been to court with you this morning. I was a youth pastor at my first church, and I was driving to a youth group event, and I was driving a high school student, in my car to this youth retreat that we were going to because his parents couldn't give him a ride. And then all of a sudden, sirens and flashing lights behind me, and I'm pulled over, and I roll down the window. I have one of these in my Toyota Echo. And I roll it down, and the officer says, do you know why I pulled you over? And I say, no, officer. And he says, because your inspection is expired on your vehicle. And I say, no, that's not true. I just got my inspection. I open up the dashboard. He says, stop moving. Quit opening things, And I'm like, okay, sorry. Can I reach into this glove compartment and show you my receipts? And I show him my receipts, and he says, okay, I see that you've done this, but you don't have your sticker yet. And I say, but you see that I've done it. And he says, but you don't have your sticker. And so he writes me a ticket for $150 or whatever, and then I see some of you shaking your head. I've been wronged. Yeah, that's what I want you to feel. And, uh, and so I go back to the mechanic that was supposed to do my inspection, and I didn't have a sticker. And they said, well, we've done some of the inspection, but afterwards you need to drive it around for 50 to 100 miles or whatever, and then you come back and see us again because we're still doing your emissions part of the inspection. And I said, why didn't you tell me that? And so we do all of the stuff, and it comes back, and they're like, well, we need you to install a new oxygen sensor. And I don't know what that is, you know? And I mean, I would have paid for blinker fluid if they had asked me to. I would have said, fill that sucker up, man. And so, oh man, $300 later, fixing parts to pass emissions. And they said, well, you still haven't passed, but the good news is you qualify for a waiver, and so you don't have to get anything else fixed. And I said, yeah, it's great. I'm glad I spent $500 between this and the ticket and everything else just to say you haven't passed, but you can try again next year. So I'm like, okay, I need to show up to court. I don't want to pay this ticket. I've tried my best, and to be honest, $500, I'm a youth pastor. This is my paycheck, and I've got a wife and a kid and whatever else. So I get my folder together with all of the receipts, with all of the tickets and fines and receipts and all of the evidence, and then I dress up like I'm going to church on Sunday morning, because I'm going to court, people, and I'm going to face a judge. And I get to the courthouse, and I look around, and I see people in sweatpants and wife beaters and shorts, and I'm like, man, do I look like a dork? I'm overdressed. The judge is not going to think that I'm cool, and I don't want to look like a fool, but here I am, the only guy with a folder, the only guy. So I get into the courtroom, and the judge says, how do you plead, innocent or guilty? And I didn't realize that this was going to be the way we started out. And so I'm like, I was guilty. You know, and I had hoped that before he could speak and say, well, the case dismissed. So I said, but I'm coming to you for mercy. Let me tell you the story. I'm a youth pastor at Armbrust Wesleyan Church. Sometimes I like to throw my title around. I'm hoping it'll get me something. And I say, and this is what happened, Your Honor. And I've got a wife, I'm newly married, and we've got a kid. He's less than a year old, and to be honest, this is a paycheck, all that I've been through, and I'd much rather pay bills or buy groceries than pay for this. And the judge shakes his head, and then he says, I'm sorry that we put you through this. And he looks at the cop that pulled me over, and he said, I am so frustrated that this is the experience of some of our people. How do you know that you're forgiven? Is it because a judge told you that you're forgiven? Is it because someone said that you trust, you don't owe us anything? Well, it turns out that when Jesus tries to tackle this question, he actually doesn't want to appeal to the information that we know. He doesn't actually want to appeal to what we believe in. He's not saying, let me see your doctrine. It turns out when Jesus wants to know, how do we truly know that we've been forgiven? And I mean know it in our bones. What he wants us to do instead is he wants us to look in a mirror and ask the question, do I live a forgiven life? It turns out that when Jesus wants to know, do you really know in your heart that you've been forgiven? He's much more interested in asking the question, well, how easy is it for you to forgive others? And so we find Matthew 18, Jesus is having a discussion with his disciples, and Peter kicks things off, and we imagine that Peter is super excited, I imagine, to say this to the Messiah, because you can just picture Peter going, man, I get it. I know what we're all about, and my next question is really going to impress Jesus. And so Peter says, it says, Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? And you have to understand that for the Jewish people, in their Jewish psyche, what they are teaching their people in the Talmud and the commentaries that we have from rabbis that are reading the Old Testament scriptures, they're saying, well, it looks like God will forgive us up to 3 times. It looks like you're allowed to say, oh, Lord, I really botched it. God, I didn't do good, and you know it, and we both know it. And I'm guilty in your sight, and I promise I'll try to make it better. Will you forgive me? And God says, yes. And then you start following him again until finally you go, oh, Lord, do you remember that thing that I said I would never do again? I've done it again. And I don't know why or how, but I've done it again. And I really meant it before when I said I wouldn't, but here I am. You all have experienced that. Yeah, I've experienced that. And just going, Lord, will you forgive me again? And it'll never happen after that. I'm your guy. And then somehow, man, do you find yourself before the Lord one more time saying, Lord, that thing that I did once and twice, I've done it a 3rd time, and you know it and I know it, and I'm sorry. And the Jewish people believed that was it, man. Okay, but that's it, and nothing else after that. And they're getting that from certain passages in Job and other places where it seems like maybe God is saying 3 times but no more. And so Peter, he's tracking with Christ and he's thinking to himself, man, I'm going to hit it out of the park with this question. Jesus, what about 7 times? I know you like that number. And Jesus goes, we're told, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. And actually what Jesus is doing is he's borrowing from Genesis chapter 4, I believe it's verse 22. Lamech says, if Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech is avenged 77 times. And what he means is that if anybody wrongs me, I won't do 7-fold the damage back to you. I'll do 77 times the damage back to you. You better not mess with Lamech. And what Jesus is saying is the people of the kingdom, my followers, should be just as passionate about forgiveness as the world is about vengeance. Can we even meet up with what the world wants to do with evil? Will we even allow our good to meet it? 77 times you should forgive. And if you're like the rest of us, you're going, how on earth could I ever do that? It's hard enough to be wronged once and to be wronged 77 times. For most of us in the room, we're going, how on earth could I ever do that? And Jesus says, let me tell you how it's done. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. The NIV translators are taking some liberty with the text. 10,000 talents, and a talent is a weight of measure, and the currency isn't named. We don't really know. Jesus, when he talks about debt and money and talents, he usually doesn't name the currency in his parables. And I think one of the things that's happening is Jewish people, oftentimes they talked about weight, and when they did, sometimes they were talking about God's glory, or the weight of forgiveness, or the weight of God's goodness. And so to a certain extent, when we think about the man that buried his talent in the field, one of the things that we're seeing is somebody that knows a little bit about God's goodness, and they're hoarding it to themselves. Here, there's a man who knows 10,000 talents of God's goodness in this parable. So Jesus usually doesn't talk about currency, but instead weight. And weight in the Jewish psyche had to do with the goodness of God. But 10,000 talents, many commentators say, if we had to put a number on it, a talent is about 6,000 denarii, and this is equivalent to then 60 million denarii that this man owes. A denarii is about a day's wages, or a denarius is about a day's wages for a day laborer of Jesus' time. And so commentators who are smarter than me and church treasurers would say it would take about 164,000 years for this man to pay off his debt. And one of the things that Jesus is saying is, when you owe a debt against the Lord, it's an insurmountable debt. You can't pay it with the lifetime that you've been given, and you've only been given one lifetime. And so we go on to read, as he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. In Old Testament scriptures, as well as in ancient Rome, we actually have a document from one Roman that says that his dad was caught cheating on his taxes, and so he was sold into slavery because of something his dad did. And so the reality that you could make financial decisions that could not only mean you're going to prison, you're going to jail, or you're being sold into slavery, but also that your wife and kids could be sold into slavery as well, was a reality of their day. And so I remember one of my friends who is newly married, and he enjoyed online poker. And it started out as a hobby where he would spend $50 to get digital chips, and then he would play poker against opponents that he couldn't see. Raise your hand if you've, never mind. And so, I mean, you can't see. You don't know their tells. You don't know if they're bluffing. Half the skill of poker is gone. But he loved it anyway. And so, $50 here and there, not a big deal. And then next thing he knows, he's $500 deep. And he's thinking, man, I don't want to tell my wife how I've been spending our money, but I'm good at this. I've won poker hands before. I can do this. And so I'll spend another $500 getting myself out of this hole. And maybe if I'm lucky, I'll double our money. And I'll say, baby, it's going to be a great Christmas. You won't believe what I just did. And he finds himself then eventually $10,000 in it. And he's thinking now to himself, how do I tell my wife that I spent $10,000 on money we could have used on nothing? But I need to tell her before this gets any worse. Here's a man who's thinking to himself, how do I tell my wife and my kids that I bet it all and we're all going to be sold into slavery? At this the servant fell on his knees before him. "Be patient with me," he begged, "and I will pay back everything." The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. You owe nothing. There's an insurmountable debt. You could never pay it in your lifetime or in 100 lifetimes, and you owe nothing. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He owes him 100 denarii. It would take him 100 days of labor to pay it back. He grabbed him and began to choke him. "Pay back what you owe me," he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, "Be patient with me, and I will pay it back." But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. If you're a Jewish listener and you heard this story but not the one before it, you would have thought to yourself, that seems right. That seems just. That seems fair. That man should have known what he was getting himself into. He owed, and so he had to pay up. But because Jesus prefaces it with this story about what the first servant got when he didn't deserve it, now you're going, man, what's wrong with this guy? He refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. It's worth it to mention for a moment that they use the exact same words. The first servant should have been like, man, this is deja vu. I remember what it's like to get on my knees and to beg and say, "Be patient with me, I'll pay it back." Because the second servant says, "Be patient with me, I'll pay it back." And it should have triggered in his memory his own forgiveness, and it doesn't. When the other servants saw what happened, they were outraged and went and told the master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. "You wicked servant," he said, "I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?" In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. Now, I need to pause for a minute and say, this is a parable. It's not an allegory. In a parable, not everything stands for something else. In an allegory, everything, every detail, every little thing has a parallel with some other greater truth. A parable is more like a metaphor where some things are and some things aren't. Some things are true in that metaphor and some things aren't true. Some things stretch the metaphor beyond its intention. And so it's here that we want to say, God doesn't have torturers. Most of us, we understand and we get that. So not everything in this parable has a parallel with reality. But when I see a parable, I'm not just seeing a literary device. When I see a parable of Jesus, I'm not just talking about how this tool or how this genre is meant to be used. It's not a purely academic exercise, because when I see a parable of Jesus, what I'm really seeing is God the Son saying, "Let me show you a peek behind the curtain. Let me show you reality. Let me show you what you don't know in terms that you might get." And so when I see Jesus sharing a parable, what I see is God the Son saying, "Wait a minute. You don't know what I know. Let me tell you how the universe really runs." And so Jesus will say, "This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart." Now, we want to debate. We want to get into it. We want to know, is it works righteousness? Is Jesus saying that I have to forgive? I have to earn my salvation? Is the pastor saying that that's what Jesus is saying? Because if so, I need to find another church. And I will say, he says until he pays back everything he owes. He doesn't say this person is going to hell. But again, if we start talking about all of this, one of the things that we're doing is we're getting caught up in the minutia of a parable that is not meant to be treated as an allegory. What Jesus really wants me to understand is that the King so easily forgives my more than lifetime worth of debt that I could never pay off. But it's my unforgiveness that angers him, which is shocking, surprising. If we're honest with ourselves, if we allow ourselves to think about our life, think about what skeletons might be in your closet, think about the things that you've only told your wife, or that you've only told your pastor, or that you've only told your accountability partner. Think about those things that you're on your deathbed and you say to the preacher, I've never told anyone this before, but I need you to know it because someone needs to know it. Think about those things, and God is saying, I care more about your unforgiveness towards others than I did about all of those things. So if I'm reading this parable, I'm also thinking to myself, because I tend to do this, what exactly is forgiveness? How do I know when I've done it? How do I know when I've forgiven somebody? Because I can say all day, I've forgiven you. I've forgiven them, Lord. Lord, I forgive. But how do I know? And it turns out I need a couple things. The first thing I need is grace. Y'all might not like this. Grace, the technical term, is unmerited work of God in us, for us, and through us. See, some of you fell asleep just then. The unmerited work of God. It's unearned. I haven't done anything to deserve it. So when the servant comes before the king, it's not because he dressed right. It's not because he's got the right folder with the right documents or the right backstory. It's just because he says, Lord, be patient with me. I'll try to pay it back. And the king says, that's good enough. Why? Because forgiveness is based not on the recipient. It doesn't have anything to do with the capacity for you to receive forgiveness. It has everything to do with who the king is. And the king says, no, my capacity to love, my capacity to forgive, I'll do it. I forgive. I love. I'll let it go. I don't need your money. I don't need you to pay back that debt. I'll pay the wages myself. God the Son will take on flesh and die on the cross and pay the wages of your sin. It's based on who the king is, which means your forgiveness, when you offer it to others, it does not depend on their resume. It doesn't depend on whether or not they're a qualified candidate for forgiveness. It doesn't depend on what they'll do for it. It's not a question of who are they and do they deserve it. It's who am I? And am I the type of person that can forgive? Am I the type of person that can love? Am I the type of person with the capacity to forgive? And if so, how much am I willing to forgive? It's grace. It's not based on them, it's based on us. And if I look again and I say, what is forgiveness? I see again that forgiveness is somebody that's willing to say, you don't owe me. Somebody that's willing to say, there's nothing that you need to do to get back in my good graces again. You don't owe me. You don't have to make it right. So many times people wrong me, and I think, man, now they owe me. Man, now I can use it to my advantage. Now they know that they need to make it up to me. That's not forgiveness. Forgiveness doesn't think like that. Forgiveness says, okay, there is no debt here. And forgiveness does not seek to punish. Forgiveness is willing to let it go. Not only does it not need the other person to make it right, but it also doesn't need to exact vengeance. It doesn't need to even out the playing field. It doesn't need like two siblings, one who punches the other and the other who punches him back and says, okay, we're even now. You punched me and I got to punch you. Forgiveness is not needing to punish. And so Jesus says, if you've really been forgiven, what you'll do is you'll lean into your forgiveness. You'll know. See, because when the world handles sin, when the world handles somebody has done something wrong, it only thinks of two options. Option one is to get vengeance. Option one is to make it right. Option one is to cancel them and, to destroy them and put them on blast and be relentless about it on social media and the news outlets and whatever until we find the next person who has done something unforgivable, and then we'll focus and destroy their lives as well. Or it is to diminish the sin so much that you actually don't really have anything to be sorry about. This is the person that thinks that they're your friend, but they never tell you when you're wrong. This is the person that hears what you've done and wants to make it everybody else's fault all the time. This is the person that always has your back and makes you feel like you've never had anything like you're God. And you could never do anything wrong. Or it's the world's tendency to shout, celebrate, champion sin and pretend like it's not sin. It's the world's tendency to deny what God says in Jeremiah, that the people, they are unashamed and they don't even know how to blush anymore. They've forgotten how to experience any form of shame at all. This is the world's two options. Sin either doesn't exist or it's unforgivable. And Jesus says, no, in order to be capable of forgiving others, what you actually need to do is you need to champion the dignity of God's mercy. In other words, Jesus is not willing to diminish the dignity of God's mercy. He says, no, you owed an enormous debt that you could never in your dreams pay off. And so in order for me to be able to forgive others, it's not that I need to diminish sin, but instead it's I need to know how to name my own sin. I owe a debt. I need to know how to name my own sin. Yes, Lord, I've done things that were against your way, against your will, against your love, against you and against others. I'm a perpetrator of sin. But we also need to be people that know how to name our guilt. 164,000 years I could work to pay off this debt. I could never owe it. I could never pay it in my lifetime. I need to know how to look at my guilt and take it seriously. I need to know how to look at the punishment that was owed me and allow it to be true. In other words, I was telling somebody else the other day, my wife is married to a pastor, of course, and so there will be times where she will say things like, man, I really want to buy this thing for myself, and I'll say, honey, you barely ever ask for anything. You keep this whole show going. You love our family, and you do so much, and you ask for so little. Of course you should buy that. You deserve it. And she'll go, well, I deserve hell. And she knows I don't actually have a retort. And all of us were a little bit, we don't like that. We don't like a pastor's wife who's 30-something years old, who's a good mama, saying, I deserve hell. But you're so pretty, babe. You know, we don't like it. But the fact of the matter is, I remember in high school, I was at a Bible study, and I was in high school, and I was at a Bible study, and one of the teenagers says, "Don't you think it's unfair that some people have to go to hell?" And one of the other teenage boys, who I thought was really cool, he speaks up, and he says, "Actually, I think it's unfair that some people get to go to heaven." Because he understood that what we all deserve, what we all earn, is hell. What we're getting is unmerited, undeserved, unearned. None of us deserve to look at God the Son dying on the cross and then say, "Yeah, that makes sense to me." None of us deserve to look at Jesus Christ on the cross and say, "Yeah, that makes sense to me. I deserved that." No. So I have to know my sin, my guilt, and the punishment that I've earned, Jesus says, in order to be able to turn around and forgive others 77 times without it fazing me. Okay. So we're all going to leave here, and we're going to do what I tend to do, which is I close the Bible, I put it down, and I think about it, and then I think, man, when someone wrongs me, I better forgive them or God's going to be mad at me. I mean, my tendency is to walk away from a passage like this or a message like this and think, man, the next time someone forgives me, I need to remember this because I don't want to upset God. And to be honest, if that's what we've heard, then actually we've missed it. We've missed it by a hair, but it makes all the difference. We've missed it because the king doesn't say, "Don't you know how mad I was going to get?" He doesn't appeal to his anger. Instead, what the king says, let me read it to us. He says, "Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?" He doesn't say, "Don't you know how mad I was going to be?" He says, "I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?" It is the sense in which he's saying, "Don't you know my way? I am the king. You are my servant. I forgave your debt. Don't you know my way?" Jesus is not appealing to, the master's going to be mad at you. Jesus is appealing to understand your forgiveness and the way of God, so that when I leave here and someone wrongs me, my job is to say, "God, I understand what you've done for me." When someone wrongs me, what I've gotten now is the opportunity to say, "God, I choose to worship you. God, I choose to do things your way. God, this person wronged me, and it's not that I'm mad or I'm concerned about how mad you're going to be. Instead, Lord, it's a time for me to say, God, I get it, and I know your way, and I know just what to do. They owe me nothing. I cancel their debt. They don't have to make it right, and I won't punish them." At this time, I'd like to invite our band to come up. And what we're going to do next is we're going to sing a song, a worship song. We're going to respond and worship the Lord. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to invite you to come forward. And if there's a debt that someone owes you, if someone has wronged you and you've been carrying this around like, Lord, they have to make it right. Or if you're thinking to yourself that there's some part of you that has unforgiveness and you'd like to just come up and say, Lord, they owe me nothing. I want you to use this next song, this time, to just come up to the altar, get on your knees before the Lord and say, Lord, they owe me nothing.